show of applause, let's welcome Stan the Man, ladies. So we were just asking,
How long do we have to stay here?
what time is your flight leave?
Wait a minute, I heard there were a couple people here who didn't see the Avengers. You had time, you could go see them now. We'll still be here.
Hey, by a show of hands or noise, who saw the Avengers twice?
You asked them what our trick was.
I don't know. What was the
I just told you about it 5 minutes ago. If I forget it, I'll tell them.
You know how you say you can't hear that great? I don't listen that well.
Nobody listens to me. I'm used to it. Now, here's the story. But this is just between us. Do I see an empty seat back there? I'm leaving. All the seats aren't filled.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like corn. I think that part is corn.
Anyway, here's what you may wonder why my cameos are so brief. There's a reason. You see, some people go to see a movie that I have a cameo in, and they miss it because they blinked their eye or something. Then the movie has ended, and they say, wait a minute, we missed Stan's cameo. So they've got to buy another ticket and go back. Now you know the secret why the Avengers did so much business. My cameo was so brief, they missed it. But that's only between us. I don't want other people to learn this great secret. Okay, can I go now?
No, not yet. What we like to do is, of course, have you guys ask Stan questions because we know you have a lot
Why
of...
does it always have to be asking me questions? Why am I always on the hot seat? Can't we just have a nice conversation?
You want to just have a conversation?
Sure, just talk like people do. You know, how have you been? How's the family? That
How
kind of
was
stuff.
your lunch today?
I think
How was your lunch today?
I haven't seen her 2,000 miles away. What a question. How would I know?
Okay.
I can see why we ask questions.
Yes, just take questions from the
We're
audience.
not good talk.
No, when we talk to each other in the back, you don't want to hear that. It's not nice. No, I think we have a microphone set up. Is that what you guys are there? So, each side. So we're going to go right and left and my right, or whatever. I'm going to ask you to speak loudly because where we're sitting, we can hardly hear anything. So I'm going to repeat the question sometimes to Stan, just so you know. Okay? So let's start with the first one.
Hello, Mr. Lee. I just wanted to ask, what gave you the idea of creating the Avengers?
Well, I had all these characters, and I figured I ought to do something with them. And I can't remember it that clearly, but I had been writing the Hulk, and I was writing Iron Man and all the others, and you know, unlike our competition, I won't mention their name, all of our characters sort of lived in the same place. I mean, and they lived in New York. They didn't live in Gotham City, Metropolis. I wanted to visit Metropolis once. There ain't no such place. They lived in New York, and I figured, well, if they all live there, they'll run into each other sooner or later, and I wrote little stories where in the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man appeared and so forth. And then I guess one day I must have figured, why not bring a lot of them together? Oh, I think also, no, Colonel Fury came later. So I have to remember the order of these things. The greatest thing is that S.H.I.E.L.D. is part of it now. I love S.H.I.E.L.D. Does anybody know what S.H.I.E.L.D. stands for? S-H-I-E-L-D?
Tell us.
Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement Logistic Division. What do you say?
Yeah. Well, the reason I asked, I couldn't hear it clearly, but I think they've changed it from what I had it. When I created SHIELD, it stood for, see, I can remember, Supreme Headquarters International Law Enforcement Division. And I think they probably got a better thing now. I had to make mine up very quickly because we had a fast deadline. But anyway, I figured we'd get these guys all together and let them go fight people. So that's how the invention was born. Now, don't you go around telling, if you're interviewed by any reporters, don't make it sound that simple. Oh, Stan figured he'd let them go fight people, and that was it. I mean, when you talk to the press, you say things like, Stan spent hours and days and weeks thinking.
Next question, right there.
Hello, Mr. Lee. According to my 1990 Marvel Universe trading card of you, your first appearance was in Captain America Comics #3 in 1941. What did it take to get a job at Marvel Comics in 1941, and what does it take today?
What did I think of my job in 1941?
What did it take to get your job?
Well, what did it take to get the job? See, I have this hearing problem. I can hear okay, but somehow when they use these damn mics, it all sounds muffled to me. Anyway, what it took, I guess, was the fact that nobody else wanted the job. I'll give it to you very briefly. I was about 17, and I had had a lot of other jobs. I was an office boy. I had been a theater usher. I wrote advertising copy for a hospital. I never knew why I was advertising the hospital. Was I supposed to be trying to hope people would get sick? I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing. Anyway, I was out of a job at the moment, and I heard there was a position open at a company called Magazine Management Company. Now, they published a lot of magazines, men's magazines, pulp magazines of different types, a crossword puzzle magazine, and some comic books. I didn't know what the job was for, but an assistant was needed, so I applied. I must have been the only guy who applied because I got hired. And then I found out it was for the comic book department. Now, the department consisted of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, and a guy named David Goodman, who was the publisher's brother, and I never knew what David did in all the years I worked there. He walked around with a ruler, and he would measure pages to make sure that they were the right size. That was all. Anyway. So I was working for Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, and I had some very sophisticated things to do. I filled their inkwells. See, in those days, they used ink. You dip your pen in ink and you brush it in. I would go down and get them their sandwiches for lunch and run any errands. And I also did proofreading. And again, when the pages were drawn in pencil, they were later inked over by an inker. But somebody had to erase the page to make sure that all the pencil lines were gone. I was one of the best erasers you could ever. And man, if there could be a career erasing, I'd have been at the top of the heap. So anyway, I erased pages, and that's what I did. And while I'm sitting here talking, I'm just thinking to myself, because very often you can say one thing and you can think of another. So while I'm expanding so beautifully on what I'm talking about, I'm thinking to myself, what the hell was the question? Did I answer it or did I forget? Okay, all right. Are you satisfied, Mr. Questionnaire?
Very satisfied.
Okay. Thank you.
So, Mr. Lee, no doubt that Spider-Man is your best, because technically none of us would really be here unless you made that Spider by Parker in Amazing Fantasy. But if you had to choose, other than Spider-Man, who would be your favorite Marvel character in general?
Now here's another thing I never understand about questions. The question apparently is, other than Spider-Man, who's your favorite Marvel character? But he was talking for about 2 minutes before he said it. So what was he saying before that?
That's what he said. Honestly. Exactly what he said. The other words were just like frosting on a cake. It was all.
It was leading up to it,
Yes, right.
See, another thing, I have absolutely no idea where the voices come from. And I'm looking there, I might have been over there, I don't know.
That's a good quote right there.
So what was the question? My favorite Marvel? Well, who told you Spider-Man was?
Well, I would just figure because, you know.
No, you're not on the hot seat. It's all right. I really love them all. In fact, when I was writing them, whichever one I was writing them at the moment, that was my favorite. Because I used to act them all out, you know. When I wrote Thor, I would say, so be it. You know, I tried to talk like a Norse god would talk, because I'm very familiar with how Norse gods talk. And when I was writing Doctor Strange, I'd say things like, by the hoary hosts of August, what's happening? And I got into it, so I loved all the characters. I loved talking like the Thing, too. Those damn Yancey gangs, I'd kill them. And I never talked like the Invisible Girl. I left that to other people. The question was, no, I don't really have any favorite character. If I was smart, I would just pick the one that sells the best and say that's my favorite. And then you'd all say he's pretty clever.
Hey, that's a good answer. All right, next one up here.
What encouraged you to make Spider-Man?
Greed. Leave it alone and go to the next question, because that was a good reception. But I'll just add a little bit more, and you'll be wishing I had left it alone. What happened was, I had already written the Fantastic Four, and I don't remember the order of them, maybe the Hulk and the X-Men. And I needed something else, because I had a greedy publisher. He felt we were on a roll, and he said, come on, give me some more characters. So I came to him one day, and I said, I've got this idea. I think it's great. It's a guy called Spider-Man, and he's a teenager, and he has a lot of problems, personal problems. So my publisher, his name was Martin. Martin looked at me like I was from another planet. He said, Stan, are you kidding? That is the worst title I ever heard. People hate spiders. You can't call a book Spider-Man. And you say you want him to be a teenager? Teenagers can only be sidekicks. And then he said, and you want him to have problems? Stan, don't you know what a superhero is? So as you may be gathering now from the Insight Throne, he didn't like the idea. So a few months later, we were publishing a magazine that wasn't selling, and we decided to drop it, and we were going to put the last issue out. When you put out the last issue of a magazine, nobody cares what you put in it, because it's the last issue. It's not going to sell anyway. So just to get it out of my system, I put Spider-Man in the last issue of, what was the name of it? Amazing Fantasy, yeah. And it sold like crazy. So when the sales figures came in, Martin called me into his office, and I swear this is what he said. Hey Stan, you remember that idea of yours about Spider-Man that we liked so much? Why don't we do a series? And that's how Spidey was born.
On this side.
Mr. Lee, my question may not be as extravagant as all the others, but what does Excelsior mean?
You know, you're probably going to say, I wish they'd stop asking them questions, because every question ends up with a long speech. Excelsior requires a long speech. Am I using this mic okay, Eric? It sounds like the sound is coming and going to me. Anyway. I heard one guy say, unfortunately. I had used little expressions. I used to write a column called Stan's Soapbox, and I had something called bullpen bulletins, and I also would write little notes and captions of the stories, and I tried to add, I love expressions. So sometimes I would end by saying, "Nuff said," or I'd say, "hang loose," or "face front," or anything I thought of. Little by little, I noticed that the competition was starting to use those phrases also. I didn't like that. I thought if I could only find something that I could say that they wouldn't use, because A, they wouldn't know what it meant, and B, they wouldn't know how to spell it. They weren't very bright. So I realized that on the Great Seal of the state of New York, it says Excelsior. Now, I know there are some of you sitting there saying to themselves, to yourselves, what was Stan doing looking at the Great Seal of the state of New York? And I don't remember how I happened to see it. But somehow or another, I did see it. And I looked up the word Excelsior. Now, if you look in the dictionary, the first thing it says is, it's that stuff you put in packages so a fragile object won't get broken when you mail it. It looks like sand, this crumbly stuff. And I figured, well, that isn't a good expression. But then there's a second definition. And you have to look in a big unabridged dictionary, because a little dictionary may not give you this definition. But the second one is, it's an old English expression which means upward and onward to greater glory. Now, what could be better than that? So that's what I decided to write. Now, the funny thing is, I would get so much mail from fans saying, how come you use a word that means the packing stuff? And I'd have to write a letter and say, get a bigger dictionary. See what I mean? A simple question, I've been talking for a half hour. I'm sorry.
I think the new dictionary should probably just, the third definition should be what Stanley says. That should be, I think that'd be wonderful. Go ahead, buddy.
Hey, Stan Man. What makes a complete character? And out of all the characters you've created, is there one that you feel is more complete than the others?
Well, I'm not sure I know what you mean. By complete, you mean a fully fleshed out character that everybody understands?
Yes.
Can relate to? Well, I'd like to think that every character I ever wrote was complete. Maybe, you know, I don't know, you could argue about that, I guess, for years. I really do think a lot of them are complete. I was going to say Iron Man, Tony Stark, to me, the way I wrote him was complete, but then I thought Reed Richards was, and I think Spider-Man is, and I love Daredevil. I thought he was pretty complete when I was writing him. Doctor Strange, you couldn't get completer than Doctor Strange. Irving Forbush, hey. A lot of you don't know Irving Forbush, I'm sorry about that. No, I don't really know how to answer that. But if I have to take a guess, maybe Spider-Man was the most complete, because we know more about his private... Oh, I'll tell you another thing that we did at Marvel. I say we because I'm being modest. I really did. When I wrote the stories, I don't know if any of you noticed, I don't know if you noticed, Jimmy, I used a lot of thought balloons. balloons more than anybody has ever used in comics. And the reason I use thought balloons, because if you can get to know what a person is thinking, you know that person pretty well. See, in most comics, it was all dialogue balloons. Oh, there's a bad guy. I'm a good guy. I better try to beat up the bad guy. You know, dialogue. But with me, there would be a thought balloon. Uh-oh, if I try to fight him, I may get hurt. So maybe I'll pretend I didn't see him. See, I could be thinking that. You get to know the guy is a coward. So by a learn about people. So anyway, that's why I use thought balloons, and that's why I think all of our characters were pretty complete, because we knew what they were thinking. How's that? That's great.
I got a question. Mary Jane, Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker, was that based on like when you were a younger man and you had to choose between two women? Was that like, you know, was that from experience? That kind of stuff?
When I was a young man, I was not lucky enough to know either of Gwen Stacy or Mary Jane. I knew some girls, but they were not Gwen Stacy or Mary Jane. Very few teenagers have known a Gwen Stacy or Mary Jane. Tell you a funny thing about that, though. Originally, I came up with Gwen Stacy. And John Romita and I worked on her, and we tried to make her, he drew her as beautiful as you could make a girl, and I tried to write her as though she's the nicest girl. I wanted Peter to fall in love with her, and eventually they'd get married. Then we introduced Mary Jane, and it was as though she was a real living person. We couldn't stop her from being the one with the most personality, because Gwen Stacy, I just tried to make a lovely, wholesome, pure, wonderful girl. But Mary Jane, we made her hip and cool and with it and modern and fun. And after a while, it was as if they were living people. And we couldn't find a way to make Gwen Stacy as interesting as Mary Jane. And then, of course, the writer Jerry Conway, after I left the strip, he must have felt the same way, because he killed Gwen Stacy. Which I thought was a terrible thing to do, because a few issues earlier, I had killed her father, Captain Stacy. And it was as though we had something against the whole Stacy bit.
Okay, very good.
Hi, Mr. Lee. I'm actually a really big fan of yours. Well, actually, I think we all are. But my question is, in the 1960s, I watched a movie about comic books. And so in the 1960s, you were about to leave Marvel. And so I'm wondering, why were you about to leave Marvel?
Well, now let's be specific. Do you want to know why I was about to leave Marvel, or do you want to know why I didn't? Because I'm a very specific person. Or do you want to know both? Which I think so. I had been working at Marvel, which then was called Atlas. First it was called Timely Comics. Then it was called Atlas Comics. It had a lot of names in between. I don't even remember them. But at the time it was, I think, Atlas Comics. And I had been writing stories for quite a few years. But I was writing the kind of stories that Martin, my publisher, wanted me to write. He had very little respect for our readers. He thought that comic book readers were either very young children or adults who weren't too smart. So he would say to me, Stan, I don't want you to put in too much dialogue. Don't use words of more than 2 syllables. Don't worry about characterization or plot. Give me a lot of action. I want to see a lot of action on every page. Well, he wanted to see action. I wanted to make a living, so that's what he got? He got action. And after about 15 or 20 years or whatever it was, I was really tired of writing those kind of stories, even though they were doing well. And incidentally, we also did other kind of books. We did teenage books like the Archie Group. We had Millie the model, Tessie the typist, Evie of Hollywood, on and on. And we had books about little kids. There was Little This and Little, I don't even remember the name, Little Joey and Little somebody. And we had war stories, and we had horror stories, and we had crime stories. But none of them I felt were that good, and I was responsible for them. So I finally said to my wife, you know, I want to quit. I want to try to write something good, or at least better than what I'm writing, which shouldn't be hard. And she said, and you may make notes if you wish, she said, why don't you do one book, the type that you want to do it the way you'd like to do it. Because even if the boss, even if Martin gets angry and fires you, you want to quit anyway, so what have you got to lose? It shows you got to marry a smart wife. That was the greatest advice. So that's when I figured, the hell with it. And coincidentally, Martin said to me at that time, you know, DC Comics, well, they were called National Comics at the time. Well, I'll tell you a story about that later. He said DC Comics has a book called The Justice League, and it's selling pretty well. It's a bunch of superheroes. Why don't you do some superheroes, and maybe we'll sell as well as the Justice League? So I figured, fine, I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do the kind that I want to do. So I did the Fantastic Four, and I didn't give them secret identities, and I didn't give them costumes and masks, and I had them live, as I told you, in New York, not Gotham City, and I tried to write it the way I thought the superhero script should be written. Luckily, it caught on, and that's why I didn't quit, because then we did other books, and now I said I would tell you about DC and the name. I shouldn't talk about DC, because they're lovely people. But in those days, they weren't as smart as we were. Let me put that out. After the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and the others sold well, I said to Martin, let's change the name of our company, because at that time we were Atlas. I said, let's get a name that we can really promote, a name that means something to the readers. And I remembered the very first magazine he ever had was called Marvel Mystery Comics, I think. I said, let's call our books Marvel Comics. And he said, fine, and he went off to play golf. But then he wasn't that interested. So I changed the name to Marvel, and as you know, we did pretty well. We started out selling National. So some genius at National said, hey, Stan Lee changed the name to Marvel, let's change our name. So I didn't know there were companies like this, but apparently they hired a company to come up with a name for them. And they paid this company money because they were name experts. And what name did they come up with? DC Comics. We were Marvel, and they were DC. What can you do with DC when you want to promote something or inspire the readers? DC Comics. So I don't want to sound like I'm knocking DC. They're all my best friends, but that was not the best choice of a name, I think. Next question.
Look for you, the cameos, that Activision has a game coming out, a Spider-Man game, right? And aren't you in that? You do something in that game?
Yeah, why should I not be in that? Yeah, Activision has this new game, and I am a playable character. It's a new Spider-Man game, and if anybody anybody is nutty enough to want to be Stan Lee in a video game, get yourself one of those book games. I haven't seen it yet, although they did send me some little pictures of me, and I don't think it does me justice. But it's kind of funny to be a character in a video game. I had forgotten about that. Thanks for
You
reminding
got
me.
superpowers in it?
I don't know, I haven't played it yet.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. Yes, I do, because I go swinging around town like Spider-Man does. I don't know how they explain it, 'cause I haven't played the game yet, but I'm sure they have a very good explanation.
I think it's worth it just buying to be Stan Lee in the game.
To see what I look like.
That's right, exactly.
They're going to be so happy we mentioned it. Wow.
I got a question over there. Anybody there? Fall asleep?
I have a question for you. Me and my friends have a long-standing debate about who would win in a fight. Not in comic books, but in real life we're talking about here. Would it be Spider-Man or Superman in your opinion? Because you help us solve this.
Okay, I have my answer and Stan. So who would win in a fight, Superman or Spider-Man?
That is the easiest question. But the answer may not be what you expect. You know what? The winner would be whomever the writer wants it to be. I feel I have to answer these things truthfully.
That's right. Okay, good done.
How did you learn about to like comics?
One more time. How did you want to write?
How did you learn to like comics?
I don't need any more competition. I don't know. I guess the way you learn to do anything, first you have to read a lot of comics and see how they're written. What is the particular style? Why is a comic book different than a television show or a movie or a novel? And once you're familiar with comics, and once you think you know what makes a good comic or a bad comic, then you try writing them. But like anything else, you have to do a little studying first. You have to know comics. And the only way to know them is to read them. And of course, reading Marvel is the best. This sort of help us out.
Hi, I'm Reese. What inspired you to write comics?
I never really thought I'd be a comic book writer. As I mentioned earlier, maybe you came in late. As I mentioned earlier, I had had a lot of little jobs, and I was looking for another job, and I heard there was a position open in a publishing company. It turned out to be in a comic book area. I really, when I was young, I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be a lawyer, because I had seen a movie where the lawyer was the hero, and he made such a great speech, and he got a guy off from the electric chair, and I wanted to be a hero. And I wanted to be a lot of things. I never said to myself, oh, I'd like to be a comic book writer. Because in those days, there weren't that many comic books. Most of the comic books were reprints of newspaper comics. And then there was one book called Famous Funnies, I think, and that reprinted newspaper comics. Then after a while, Superman came along. I never really read that. Not that there was any reason not to. I never thought of it. And then Captain America came along, and I did read that because I loved Kirby's artwork. But I never thought of being in the comic book business because it didn't seem like much of business. Nobody really cared about comic books in those days. And boy, apparently they care about them now because look at the size of the comic book conventions. I think that's great.
Things that if you can't get enough of Stan, which we know you guys can't get enough of him, I want to recommend you go to www.therealstanlee.com. check it out. It's
Hope you're all making notes.
Yes, make a note. Stan is on Twitter, and he actually does throw out his wisdom every once in a while. It's a lot of fun. If anybody's following it, they understand how much fun Stan is on Twitter. But Stan is at The Real Stan Lee. That's the name on Twitter. Join, follow Stan, and listen to his madness. And I'm telling you, it's a great, fun time. I write stuff to you sometimes too, but under other names, so you don't know it's me. I go with the DC Comics guy. Anyway, I'm kidding. And the last thing I just want to recommend is we have www.youtube.com, and it's The World of Heroes, and you can subscribe to it, and it's more Stan. It's just a lot of Stan. But, you know, he wishes he could be everywhere. In the digital world, you are. You're out there with everybody. So I just wanted to mention these things. And we're going to have 2 more questions. We're going to take right on this side, right?
What's the greatest advice you've ever been given?
No, I really don't know. I've never thought about it. I think maybe my wife saying, write the stories you want to write. I can't think of anything else in the... Oh yeah, when I was I talked a lot in school. That will surprise you. And I had a teacher named Mr. Ginsburg, and I will never forget Mr. Ginsburg, because he used to say, Stan, I want you to lock up your mouth and throw away the key, and you can't open your mouth till I throw the key back to you. And I was about 8 or 9 years old, and to me, that was a command. He said that, and boy, my lips were shut. And if he didn't remember to throw that key back to me at the end of the day, I wouldn't have spoken until the next morning. So maybe the best advice I got was to shut up sometimes and not talk so much.
Well, we thank God you didn't listen to that, that's for sure. My dad told me one time, he says, don't park in the middle of the street. That was his advice. Like, don't park in the middle of the street. That's what he told me. It was good advice, but I was like, that's it? That's what you've been waiting to tell me?
All my life I've been waiting.
I've been parking on the right and the left, and now you tell me not to park.
I gotta tell you one thing. Man and boy, I've done a lot of panels. There is nobody better to do a panel with than Jimmy Palmiotti. This guy is so...
I'm so happy to be here, as you know, and I look forward to this. I flew in just to do this panel.
And I wouldn't have done it if not for Jimmy.
That's right.
Unless they paid me.
But you get paid? Anyway, okay, let's get last question. I'm sorry, guys, that's all we got time for.
In this world of heavy controversies, I just wondered, is there any one of your productions that has become very controversial, and how did you handle it?
Well, luckily, if we're talking about movie productions, they can be controversial, but I let the people producing the movie worry about it, so I'm out of it. And so it doesn't concern me, but everything is controversial. I mean, when the first Spider-Man movie was made, before it was seen, everybody was saying, you can't have Tobey Maguire playing Spider-Man. What kind of a hero is he? So there was big controversy. Of course, everybody loved it after he was in it. And there's been controversy about the Fantastic Four and the Hulk. And there are always people who say you shouldn't have done that. You should. Probably the only two that haven't had any controversy are Iron Man and the Avengers. Those two people seem to love it. But controversy is really a great thing. When you're in the field of entertainment, you want people to talk about you. You want people to talk about what you do. So a little controversy, or even a lot, that's great, because people, the worst thing in the world is to write a story, do a television show, do a movie, anything like that, and have nobody talk about it. You're dead. You want controversy. So thank you for bringing that up, whoever you are in this vast panel of darkness.